We're more united and more determined to stand up for Canada than at any time in my entire lifetime. We made it clear to President Trump and to the world that Canada is not for sale and Canada will never, ever be a 51st state.
President Trump has been celebrating his tariff campaign as a victory, pointing to the billions collected for Washington. In reality, those tariffs are backfiring at home, driving up prices for American families and adding pressure on U.S. businesses. While the president frames tariffs as proof of American strength, Canada is holding firm. On August 18th, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Premier Doug Ford met in Ottawa to coordinate their response, focusing on how to strengthen competitiveness at home. The contrast could not be sharper. Short-term revenue in Washington, long-term resilience in Canada.
And important discussion with Premier Ford this morning on a variety of aspects for the Ontario economy, the Canadian economy, which of course includes trade but goes much more to the issues that we can control and how we build out from within.
We have to hold firm and we have to create the environment. For instance, the steel sector. The steel sector, we have to look at the large infrastructure projects, shipbuilding, and make sure that large-scale infrastructure projects like a pipeline, the steel pipes come from Ontario.
On August 18th, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford stood side by side in Ottawa. Their focus was not on what Washington might do next, but on building Canada's own strength. Carney stressed the need to focus on housing, on the steel and auto sectors, and on new fields such as artificial intelligence. His point was simple. Canada must build competitiveness from within, not depend on external decisions. Ford delivered the same message in his own way.
We're united on the message of let's start worrying about how we can be competitive here. Donald Trump is so unpredictable. I don't even know if he knows what he's doing tomorrow morning.
He reminded Canadians that Trump is unpredictable, that no one can forecast what the president will announce tomorrow. The answer, he said, is to make Canada the most competitive place to invest by reducing taxes, cutting red tape, and keeping production at home. He cited last year's record numbers. In 2024, Ontario attracted $39.9 billion Canadian dollars in foreign direct investment, creating 25,000 jobs. To him, the challenge is to repeat and expand those results even under the pressure of tariffs. Both leaders framed their approach as a united one. They called it Team Canada, not just a slogan, but a strategy that brings together provinces, Indigenous communities, and businesses. And the message was not only for Canadians. Ford reminded audiences in the United States that tariffs on Canadian goods are effectively taxes on American families because the two economies are so deeply linked. Canada is not standing still. Over the past months, governments at both federal and provincial levels have rolled out packages worth tens of billions of dollars to shield industries and workers. Ontario alone has launched a $1.5 billion financing program for companies hurt by U.S. tariffs and is investing $2.5 billion in skills training so workers can transition into new opportunities. A further $500 million fund has been created to process critical minerals, ensuring that resources mined in Ontario are refined domestically. The effort goes beyond defensive spending. Ontario has signed new internal trade agreements with every other province and territory, removing barriers under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Officials estimate that could add more than $200 billion to economic output in the coming years. The federal government, meanwhile, continues to prioritize major investments in healthcare, infrastructure, and housing to reinforce social and economic stability. Together, these measures show that Canada is using the tariff crisis as a catalyst for long-term transformation.
We'll stop worrying about Donald Trump. We'll start focusing on Ontario, on Canada, and all the other provinces and territories.
Trump presents tariffs as proof of success, but they are raising costs in his own country. Canada is responding by holding firm and focusing on long-term competitiveness. This is not only a trade fight, it is a test of endurance, and Canada is showing it is ready. Carney and Ford may differ in style, but both underline the same message. Canada is not retreating, not waiting, and not bending. It is adapting, rebuilding, and preparing for the next decade. Trump's tariffs may have set the stage, but Canada has chosen to write its own script. And in this unfolding clash, endurance and vision will matter far more than revenue headlines from Washington.
The number one American vehicle built and made around the world is the Ford F-Series trucks. They're all aluminum. And they buy it from Quebec. I hit those things and I think, you know what, some of that pressure of the self-inflicted harm that they're doing on the U.S. auto sector is starting to finally bubble up.
After months of escalating trade tensions, August 1st marked another sharp turn. Donald Trump's administration raised tariffs on Canadian goods not covered by the USMCA. And this time, steel took center stage. Steel and aluminum now face a 50% levy, the highest among all sectors. It's not the first tariff Canada has faced under Trump, but it's the most economically disruptive and symbolically aggressive. What's different now isn't just the number, it's the target. Steel isn't a fringe export. It's the backbone of Canada's contribution to North America's auto supply chain. And by striking at this core, Trump isn't just pressuring Canada. He's shaking the very structure of his own industrial base.
It was a tremendous impact. I mean, these are customers and distributors we had been dealing with for many, many years. Unfortunately, the threat of the tariffs was enough to create an uncertain business climate. So our American business evaporated essentially overnight in February.
Canada supplies vast amounts of steel and auto parts to U.S. car makers, from chassis frames to precision components. When tariffs climb, Canadian exporters are often the first to feel the squeeze. The Canadian Auto Parts Manufacturers Association reports that exports to the U.S. have already dropped by 25 to 35%, depending on the company. That's not just numbers. Those are lost contracts, idle factories, and laid-off workers. In Toronto, a manufacturer like Conquest Steel experienced a sharp collapse in its U.S. orders earlier this year, not because of actual tariff enforcement, but because of uncertainty. The fear of policy instability alone was enough to freeze cross-border business. Still, rather than retaliate hastily, many in Canada are pivoting. Companies are refocusing on domestic customers, creating new product lines, and investing in long-term manufacturing capacity. Prime Minister Mark Carney's approach isn't about short-term revenge. It's about structural resilience.
I'm listening to Ford and General Motors, who are pivotal in this, starting to say things like, you're burning all of our profit.
Yet as Canadian suppliers reel from the tariffs, the pain isn't stopping at the border. The shock is rippling straight into Detroit. The U.S. auto industry depends on Canadian steel and aluminum, especially for high-volume vehicles like the Ford F-Series, which relies heavily on aluminum from Quebec. As raw material prices rise, so does the cost of assembly. Automakers can't simply switch suppliers overnight. Industry estimates warn that U.S. vehicle prices could rise by several $1,000s depending on the model, materials, and sourcing, with some projections reaching as high as $9,000 in the most tariff-exposed cases. Trump may be aiming at Canada, but the hit is landing in Michigan. This trade move wasn't born from long-term strategy. It was part of a broader performance. Trump imposed a rigid August 1st deadline and challenged countries to accept bilateral deals, many of them thin on structural substance. Canada refused to follow the pattern. While Japan, Korea, and parts of the EU agreed to expedited deals, Canada held its ground. According to Jean Charest, a senior member of Canada's U.S. Relations Council, many of these agreements are already showing signs of strain. Canada chose not to rush, and for good reason. Carney's government made it clear, a bad deal signed under pressure isn't worth the ink.
If the White House does things that are good for Detroit, they're going to be good for Ontario. The problem is they're aiming at everywhere and hitting us all, and they're going to sink important American companies along the way.
Trump's steel tariffs were meant to punish a neighbor, but the consequences may be greater for his own economy. While Canada is adapting, investing inward, and planning beyond the U.S. market, American automakers are locked into a disrupted supply chain with rising costs and no clear off-ramp. This isn't just a bilateral dispute. It's a test of economic leadership, and as the pressure mounts, it's becoming clear. Canada may be taking the hit, but it's America's industrial base that's absorbing the blow.
A top Chinese official now says Beijing has agreed to extend its tariff truce with the U.S.
When Donald Trump's trade team sat down with Chinese officials in Stockholm this July, they came with the full weight of the president's strategy behind them. Just weeks earlier, Trump had sealed deals with both the European Union and Japan, agreements that embodied his vision of bilateral pressure and reciprocal tariffs. Now, facing Beijing, his negotiators expected that momentum to continue. But what they encountered wasn't resistance in the traditional sense. There were no walkouts, no dramatic threats. Instead, China responded with something far more deliberate, a soft but firm refusal to play by Trump's rules. They didn't walk away from the table. They sat there, listened, conceded a little, and then quietly defended their long-term position. This wasn't a retreat. It was a calculated delay.
So I think anyone who buys sanctioned Russian oil should be ready for this. Is a bill that will give the president discretion to apply secondary tariffs on sanctioned Russian oil from, I believe it's from 0 to 500%.
What was their response to that warning?
The Chinese take their sovereignty very seriously. We don't want to impede on their sovereignty, so they'd like to pay 100% tariff.
Washington came into the talks with a clear list of demands. The U.S. wanted China to cut its imports of sanctioned oil from Iran and Russia, commit to larger purchases of American goods, and reduce industrial overcapacity, particularly in sectors like steel and EVs. In return, the U.S. hinted it might delay or scale back planned tariffs. China, in response, lifted some of its restrictions on rare earth magnet exports, materials critical to U.S. defense and tech industries. But beyond that, Beijing made no promises. On oil, officials signaled they were prepared to absorb up to 100% tariffs if needed. On broader reforms, they kept their cards close. It was a clear message. China would give a little to buy time, but it would not concede its strategic posture. Rather than meet Trump head-on, Beijing chose to slow the pace. The two sides agreed in principle to extend their tariff truce, set to expire on August 12th, but no final deal was announced. U.S. officials confirmed that the pause still required Trump's personal approval. The message was subtle but powerful. China was willing to keep talking, as long as the terms didn't force them to restructure their economy on Washington's timeline. While the U.S. emphasized rebalancing trade and reshoring manufacturing, China remained focused on minimizing disruption. Instead of decoupling, they emphasized de-risking. And while Washington pushed for immediate commitments, Beijing focused on procedural cooperation, additional meetings, shared economic reports, and maintaining diplomatic space. This strategy gave China flexibility. It delayed confrontation and kept U.S. pressure in check without ceding too much ground.
And what's the biggest concession they've made?
That the Chinese have made? Well, I would say they blocked all of their rare earth magnets, and now we're getting them.
One of China's most powerful tools remains its dominance in rare earth supply. While it restored some flows of rare earth magnets to U.S. firms as a goodwill gesture, the underlying leverage remained. As of 2024, China accounted for over 90% of global rare earth refining capacity, according to data from the U.S. Geological Survey. That grip gives Beijing a built-in deterrent to any rapid escalation. Likewise, China's position on Iranian and Russian oil was deliberately firm. Instead of denying purchases, Chinese officials acknowledged the trade and accepted the possibility of penalties. In effect, they positioned themselves not as a violator, but as a sovereign actor willing to pay the price. This combination of partial cooperation and strategic firmness allowed China to hold its ground while avoiding the kind of direct conflict Trump's strategy often invites. Trump may have redrawn the map of global trade negotiations, but China isn't playing by the same map. At Stockholm, Beijing didn't fight loud. It fought long. Through limited concessions, strategic patience, and soft leverage, it resisted the core logic of Trump's deal-first model. While the White House sought fast results, China prepared for a longer game, one that tests whether Trump's system of pressure can withstand a counterpart who neither defies nor submits. In this round, there was no handshake, no headline deal. But beneath the surface, Beijing sent a clear signal. The rules may be changing, but they still get to choose when and how to respond.